Thank you for joining the open source evolution of Apache Hadoop. This 4-part web series features Tony Baer, Principal Analyst at Ovum Research, and Doug Cutting, Chief Architect at Cloudera, and creator of Apache Hadoop, discussing the world of open source and how it's influenced the development and adoption of Hadoop. Now for the first installment, Open Source, Open Standards, and Apache Hadoop.
Good morning, good day, and I'm Tony Baer, and I'm Principal Analyst with Ovum. And I have the privilege of having a chance to sit down and have a nice discussion with Doug Cutting about open source this morning. Of course, Doug really needs no introduction. He's, of course, the Chief Architect of Cloudera, but maybe let me ask you, what does Chief Architect really mean?
You know, I'm not sure. It's one of the available titles in the company, and I got assigned it, and I don't worry too much about what my title is.
It's really more about employee number then, I guess.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
But anyway, I think what's really interesting, we had a very good discussion yesterday at the Analyst meeting about just the nature of open source development and how that really, how it compares with the more traditional form of software development. Now, so let's just take this from the top, which is, how would you define, the open source development process?
Well, Apache in particular has a style that's proven very successful, and it's been a repeatable sort of recipe for building open source communities. The way Apache works is that folks come together from diverse backgrounds and collaborate to produce software. The assumption from Apache's point of view is just that people are going to cooperate. And in fact, it's a requirement. And that's pretty much all we police at Apache, is the way that people collaborate and not what kind of software they create. So it's a very different regime than the normal way that software is created, where you sort of have a top-down thing where a company decides we want to create software, people do the research, and then they direct people to write it. And it's this very traditional top-down hierarchical control. Apache doesn't work that way. Rather, Apache has no say over what sort of software is created or who creates it. Apache's management, as it were. Rather, volunteers come, and we just try to make sure that they're nice to one another and respectful, and develop a methodology for doing that. The surprising thing is how well it works. We've learned over time that this is an effective way, and we see hundreds of projects now, and thousands of developers collaborating, producing some of the most used software in the world now.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned hundreds and started to stumble on thousands, because actually your colleagues showed an interesting chart yesterday, which there was one chart which looked at the growth of the Hadoop project ecosystem from a beginning where it was basically HDFS and MapReduce down to today, where you're looking at about 30 to 40 projects, depending on who's counting and how you count. But the other end of it then becomes this very interesting sort of tangle. I'll say interesting, but what I'm wondering is, to the customer, where you start, because obviously the Apache project process, as you say, there's no process for necessarily winnowing out what should be developed. It's more like how it should be developed. How does that how does that really impact things on the customer, in terms of the customer trying to figure out, well, what's the right collection of stuff to do?
Well, at the end of the day, the customer needs to solve a problem, and they need to find what tools are most effective for solving it. And there's a wide variety of tools. A vendor can help them by providing a curated set of tools and say, we found these work well together and complement things, and we're able to provide you with support for this set, which is some incentive. We have lots of customers who use tools that we don't support. And we can't support that usage, but they're happy to take that risk on that thing if they can get support over the other collection of tools they're using. But at the end of the day, we also need to listen to the customers, and when they say, actually, we really do want to use this, and we really would like to get support for it, then we add support for that. So sometimes we can look ahead and see this is something we think will be very important for our customers. Lots of people have been clamoring for something like this. It fills a niche, and we'll be proactive about adding a project into our curated collection. Other times we'll say, no, that doesn't really fit, but our customers will say it needs to, and we say, okay, we'll support it.
Right. To what extent? Well, let's first ask with how this impacted Hadoop, but I want to also then sort of widen the scope out a little bit. But as an open source project, how that impact how did that shape the development of Hadoop?
How did the Apache ecosystem?
Yeah.
Well, it's the ecosystem as a whole is pretty fascinating. That it's moving quickly, and it's providing evolution, I think, at a level that software doesn't usually enjoy. That we've got this lack of central control. We've got a bunch of components all interoperating, but without that central control, it can move in pretty much any direction in a way that a traditionally built software ecosystem that was built around one component that is controlled by one company can't. They're constructed to never abandon that one company. And here, there's no such requirement.
I guess what I'm wondering here is that, because it almost becomes like a Chinese menu. Choose some from column A, choose some from column B, because invariably when you the process, of course, you get a competition of ideas, and you'll have different, let's say, vendors that will take different groupings of these ideas. To what extent does that either result in basically another form of vendor lock-in for the customer, or does it?
It can. I think in practice, the majority of the ecosystem are modules that are supported by multiple vendors. I think there isn't in practice that much fragmentation. There is a little towards the periphery, but I think to a large degree the vendors need to respond if another vendor's customers are finding great value in some module, then they think we better add that because we want those customers too. Once people start using a system, they don't abandon it very quickly. Software tends to be additive primarily. These kind of systems, you don't. If you deploy something to production, it's going to be there for a decade, and you're going to continue to need support for it. And so that's Cloudera will not likely abandon many things that we've adopted. That's why we try to be hesitant about adding support for new things until there really is demonstrated demand, because it's more work for us, frankly. But I don't see fragmentation. I don't see incompatibility for application developers being an issue. We don't hear that as complaint. That we built this against your ecosystem. It doesn't run against the other guys, the other vendors. For the most part, things seem to interoperate pretty well at this point.
Well, let's compare. So, like, what happened with Hadoop and what would have happened with Hadoop. Obviously, Hadoop's been open source, and we know what's happened with it as an open source project. How would things have been different if Hadoop had been developed under a more, let's say, traditional, proprietary model?
I think you wouldn't have heard much about it. When I first heard about Google's work, I was struck by how wonderful the technology was, the vision that it provided, but also at the same time, it was purely of academic interest. I didn't work at Google. I couldn't use this stuff. And most of the people I knew didn't work at Google and wouldn't be able to use this stuff. And so it similarly, at the first Hadoop meeting, some folks from Microsoft came and presented Dryad. Wonderful piece of work that Microsoft had done in this area. At the end of their presentation, there were no questions. And my interpretation of what that meant, whereas for all the Hadoop presentations there were all kinds of questions, was that people were like, yeah, that's interesting, but it has no relevance to me. Because Microsoft had no plans to release Dryad. I think they may finally be starting to get parts of it out to people now, 8 years later.
Sure.
But I think the difference really is that when you have an open source implementation, it's available to everyone. And they can pick it up and they can try it. And so even if Google had come to market with as a commercial product, or Microsoft had brought Dryad to market early on, then there would have been some hesitation by people. Do we want to get into a vendor relationship with a proprietary product at this point? And it's that hesitation that I think really hampers adoption that you don't have with open source. Developers pick it up, they try it, and it snowballs. It just gets bigger and bigger. I've seen this, first with Lucene. There was no publicity for Lucene, no marketing. It was just out there. People became aware of it. They started using it. More people started using it. They found it useful. It became more useful because they improved it.
Right.
And I think largely Hadoop's growth has been similar. It's been organic. It's been people finding that it solves a problem for them, and they start using it, and they start talking about they're using it, and other people find out about it. They improve it, and it keeps getting better, and more people hear about it. I don't think it's primarily a case. So we talk about this, the hype around Hadoop, and I basically try not to pay attention to that, but rather look at the adoption. And the reality is that the use is still doubling on an annual basis. The number of people who are adopting it, who are becoming familiar with it, which I interpret to mean that it's actually becoming useful to more people. It's not that more people are learning about it so much as it gets better, and all of a sudden there are that many more use cases that are applicable, that it's applicable to.
Tune in for the next installment, How Open Source Empowers Users and Developers, and visit cloudera.com/open for more details about Cloudera and open standards.